The silent nation that stole the West's future. The boardroom went silent when the entire machine learning team slid their resignations across the table, not for a rival across town for roles in Bengaluru and Hyderabad. One line in the deck said it all: product ownership moves east next quarter. The CFO's pen stopped mid-tap. A VP glanced at legal, nobody spoke. Power had already moved. They thought this was a blip. It was engineered, years in the making, to see why we're going back to the first great drain when India's best left and didn't look back. The return cycle, the diaspora networks, and the quiet policies that flipped the map. People made choices, policies made options, everything followed. And once momentum forms, it doesn't ask permission. The first great drain, how India lost its best. 3 decades after independence, the dream felt heavy. Paperwork stacked higher than ambition. If you wanted to start a lab, you filled forms. If you wanted to import a microscope, you wrote letters and waited months. The license Raj didn't just slow you down, it locked the door and kept the key in another ministry. So people found another door. Starting in the 1960s, engineers took the GRE with borrowed books, doctors chased residencies abroad, and scientists mailed out thick envelopes with handwritten CVs. A student from Kanpur still remembers the telegram that changed his life. Funding approved, University of Illinois. His mother cried quietly while packing his sweater. He promised he would come home in 2 years. He didn't, not because he forgot, but because momentum formed around him. Meanwhile, the United States needed him. Immigration reforms had opened channels, research universities were flush with funding, and the space race soaked up talent like dry earth. Labs had equipment ready, grants had start dates, and supervisors who said, if the experiment works, we publish next month. There was a clarity to it, and clarity is addictive, especially when your future finally has dates, not maybes. On the phone, families rehearsed a script. We're doing fine here. The winter is cold, yes, maybe next summer. Remittances started arriving, small at first, then regular. A father paid off a loan with dollars that felt unreal. A sister's tuition got covered. Temporary stretched into decades. The push at home, bureaucracy, scarce capital, rigid academia, met the pull abroad, visas, funding, ladders that climbed quickly. The stories piled up. A young cardiologist landed in Boston and saw machines his hospital back home only had in brochures. He wrote to his mentor in Delhi describing it as stepping into the future. An electrical engineer who struggled for a year to get a single oscilloscope in India walked into a California lab with shelves of them. The contrast wasn't philosophical. It was physical, and it rewired ambition overnight. While they advanced, something else began to form, a diaspora with density, not scattered but clustered. In Silicon Valley's early chip companies, Indian engineers found each other in cafeteria lines and late-night debugging sessions. They drove beat-up cars, split rent 5 ways, and built trust one weekend at a time. In the UK's NHS, Indian doctors filled rota gaps and brought stability to overstretched wards. On Wall Street, quants from IITs spotted patterns and turned algorithms into hedge fund strategies. Those clusters turned into pipelines. An IIT senior got an internship because an alum vouched for him. A med student found a residency because a consultant put in a word. A young PhD learned how venture capitalists think because a cousin invited him to a term sheet meeting. The knowledge traveled as stories, how to pitch, which journals matter, what immigration officer questions to expect at the counter. Every tip shaved months off the learning curve. Now get this, the very loss created the conditions for return. Not yet, but eventually. The diaspora learned how capital moves, how labs scale, how management really works when products hit deadlines. And back home, even through the gridlock, pockets of change were forming. Computer science departments copied syllabi, small software companies wrote code for foreign clients, and cable internet appeared in flats where dial-up had screamed the night before. The seeds were there under the dust. The human cost never stayed off the page. Weddings missed. Grandmothers buried without a last goodbye, calling cards rationed. One engineer still remembers the static clicking every few seconds on calls to Ahmedabad. He'd say, hello, hello, can you hear me? And wait through a 3-second delay to hear his father's voice. In that gap, life moved. Trust, though, grew, trust that checks would clear, that mentorship wasn't charity, that capital could be patient when the person was right. This wasn't soft power, it was personal power, the kind that turns favors into flywheels. When a founder raised his first seed round in Mountain View, the lead investor told him, I believe in you because your old boss said you never miss a shipping deadline. Reputation became currency. But the current kept pulling out. Mid-career professionals who tried to return in the 1980s bounced off barriers. A biochemist came home to Bangalore only to find the reagent shipment stuck at customs for 6 weeks. He left again. A professor who wanted to start a robotics program couldn't get approval for new lab space. He left again. The message was clear. The system could absorb remittances, papers, and phone calls, but not yet the people themselves. Meanwhile, something else was happening abroad. Indians weren't just employees, they became founders, lead surgeons, lab heads. The diaspora moved from the bench to the boardroom. With that came leverage. Alumni pools pooled capital. Weekend dinners turned into angel syndicates. A generation learned to mentor because someone had mentored them. Back home, the pressure built quietly. Every arrival at Mumbai airport carried another suitcase with another modem, another set of books, another promise to set up a scholarship. NGOs emerged that moved textbooks, old laptops, and best practices. The point wasn't charity, it was continuity. The first Great Drain hollowed out classrooms and labs, but it built highways of trust in the air. It mapped where opportunity lived and who could open doors. What nobody knew at the time was that these maps would redraw careers in reverse. But for that, India had to change the gravity. While talent kept leaving, a different India was forming at home, piece by piece, policy by policy, ready to catch what it once lost. Cracks in the wall, reforms that changed the gravity. To understand why the pull would eventually reverse, we need to go back to the year the wall cracked. 1991 wasn't a press release, it was a panic. Foreign reserves were down to weeks. A gold-laden plane stood ready for collateral. In that pressure cooker, a quiet economist turned finance minister walked in with a scalpel. He didn't shout, he unbolted doors. Licenses that once took months were scrapped or simplified. The permission to operate mindset started losing ground to disclose and comply. Import duties came down, sectors opened, and foreign investment found lanes instead of dead ends. The change wasn't romantic, it was procedural. But paperwork moves money and money moves people. While that was happening in Delhi, the signal spread to state capitals. If you can reduce friction, you'll get jobs. Telecom became the first big test. Until then, a phone line felt like inheritance. Deregulation turned scarcity into competition. Private players rolled in, fiber followed highways, and bandwidth finally left the ministry file and entered real life. Meanwhile, software parks popped up with one promise: we'll handle the permissions, you handle the code. For a generation that had only seen export as shipping cotton or steel, software made export intangible. A keystroke in Pune became a paycheck in Dallas. The outsourcing boom wasn't an accident. It needed time zone overlap, English fluency, and a credible pitch. We'll pick up the work when you sleep and return it before you wake. But beneath the pitch sat policy, satellite links, duty-free imports for hardware, single window clearances inside special economic zones. A founder from Chennai still remembers the day a leased line lit up. He looked at the ping time like a pilot watching a runway appear in fog. From that moment, clients could trust delivery dates, and trust is the first currency in global services. Education had to evolve to feed this engine. IITs and IIMs scaled cautiously, but the real expansion came from an awkward alliance: public standards with private capacity. Private universities multiplied, some mediocre, some excellent, all hungry. Entrance exams swelled. Meanwhile, community colleges and polytechnics built middle rungs so a 20-year-old could move from repairing telecom towers to supervising them. The pipeline got broader, not just taller. Here's the subtle shift people miss. Early returnees didn't come home to retire. They came to test, low-risk probes that quietly rewrote what possible felt like. A systems architect took a sabbatical from Sunnyvale to mentor a fledgling team in Noida. A pharma project manager negotiated a dual role, 3 weeks in New Jersey, 1 week in Hyderabad, just to see if lab discipline could transplant. A VC with a small fund wrote 3 angel checks in Bengaluru and told his LPs, call it research. These weren't homecomings, they were probes. Meanwhile, policy stopped lurching. Different parties, same arc: keep the economy open, keep telecom competitive, keep software friendly. Elections changed slogans, but not the underlying direction. Investors noticed something adults crave more than hype: predictability. Predictability calms fear, and calm unlocks big bets. If you're 32 and planning a decade-long career bet, you don't need fireworks, you need roads that stay in place. States started acting like rival startups. Karnataka hustled to keep its head start: SDPI offices, quicker environmental clearances, a bench of service companies that could spin up teams in weeks. Maharashtra leaned on its financial heft: back offices for global banks, then risk teams, then product analytics. Andhra and Telangana went hard on land, power, and a single point of contact: tell us your headcount, we'll get the rest out of your way. Gujarat, long fluent in manufacturing, shifted from textiles to petrochem to auto ancillaries with a simple pitch: factories need certainty, not ceremony. Telecom deregulation met a cultural unlock: cheap calling and cheaper internet. Cybercafes replaced ration shops as neighborhood hubs. A kid in Surat learned Photoshop on a shared PC and landed a remote gig designing banners for a Florida realtor. Not glamorous, but repeatable. Scale doesn't start with rocket ships. It starts with 1,000 ladders no one wrote headlines about. Government, bruised by decades of gatekeeping, started experimenting with being a platform. Digitized customs submission shaved days. PAN numbers and service tax registrations moved online. The queues didn't vanish, but the ratio changed. Paper stopped being a power move, it became a PDF. When an entrepreneur in Coimbatore incorporated a company in 10 days instead of 6 months, he didn't hold a press conference. He hired faster. Meanwhile, the first cohort of returnees began to anchor. A chip verification lead took a bet on a small design center in Bengaluru because the EDA tools finally ran smoothly over local networks. A clinical operations manager moved to Hyderabad after a state university partnered with her old lab, promising a pipeline of trial coordinators trained on GCP standards. These weren't needle-moving alone, but they were pins on a map. Pins become patterns. Patterns become playbooks. The Diaspora noticed these pins. Alumni WhatsApp groups shifted tone, less nostalgia, more due diligence. People asked boring questions that matter. What's the lease per seat? How long for a VAT refund? Is there someone who can fix power redundancy in 48 hours? And they got credible answers. When you can answer boring questions, you can place big bets. There was one problem: legacy friction didn't vanish. It retreated and regrouped, testing patience and exposing who really wanted to build. Permits still stalled. Mid-level officials still interpreted rules with creative generosity. But the macro signal kept flashing. India is open for serious work. The gap between intent and execution narrowed enough for risk-takers to cross. By the late 2000s, a returnee could live a split life without splitting their family. International schools expanded, spouse job markets matured, direct flights stitched time zones. You could land on Monday, manage a sprint, see your parents, and be back in a Bay Area stand-up by Friday. That rhythm normalized the idea that you didn't have to choose forever. You could choose a season. Reforms broke the monopoly of despair. They didn't promise perfection. They promised progress you could plan around, and that's when careers start to move. And once careers could be planned around India, gravity stopped pointing in only one direction. The table was set. Next came the sharp knives, the quiet playbook that took friction out of the last mile and turned curiosity into committed returns. The quiet playbook: talent acquisition by design. Policy opened the gates. Now came the engineering of movement: quiet, technical, relentless. The Overseas Citizen of India card took the first cut at friction. You could live, work, own property, open bank accounts, move money with fewer forms and fewer counters. Add to that faster employment visas, longer research stays, and tax clarity on foreign income. The message wasn't loud, it was precise. We're not just welcoming you, we've removed the reasons you said no. Fewer forms, fewer counters. More control. Then incentives lined up like runway lights. Startup India cut compliance costs, eased incorporation, and gave early-stage companies a tax holiday window that actually mapped to survival curves. Digital India took the friction out of identity, signatures, and filings, so a founder didn't need a fixer to file a basic return. Make in India offered a different lane. If you're a product person tired of shipping slides, come build something you can hold. The point wasn't slogans. It was stack alignment: cut the time between decision and action. States turned into recruiters with quotas. Karnataka kept pitching depth, senior engineers by the busload, vendor ecosystems that could spin up labs in weeks, and a bench of managers who'd shipped at scale. Telangana competed on responsiveness: land in 45 days, power at industrial tariffs, a single escalation number that actually picked up. Gujarat leaned into certainty: parks zoned, utilities scheduled, inspectors mapped to timelines. These weren't brochures, they were SLAs. If you've ever tried building across jurisdictions, you know why that matters. The private sector co-invested like it meant it. Big tech planted R&D flags not as back offices, but as product engines. A search giant shipped its offline-first features from Hyderabad because the user base lived outside stable connectivity. A cloud company moved core security tooling design to Bengaluru because the cryptography talent pool clustered there. Pharma multinationals grew clinical data and bioinformatics teams in Pune and Hyderabad, stitched to local universities by joint chairs. Chip companies built design and verification centers that didn't babysit. They owned tape-out schedules. Meanwhile, returnee pathways got humane. You could ask, what about my spouse? HR teams had answers: partner placement cells, professional networks for trailing partners, coaching for local licensing. What about the kids? International and IB schools expanded beyond the big three metros, and good CBSE schools added language and arts tracks returnee families expected. Compensation. Global bands with India cost of living indexing, not the old local minus package that felt like a haircut. Housing. Corporate leases near hubs so you weren't negotiating deposits across continents. Small details change big decisions. Corporate India learned to sell ownership, not just jobs. A VP in the Bay Area was told, "We need you to run a product line end-to-end, not manage a slice." That meant P&L roadmap, hiring decisions, the works. Suddenly, the calculus shifted from salary delta to control delta. If your work finally matches your responsibility, you'll move. Because here's the truth: top talent chases agency more than perks. Titles flatter, ownership sticks. Policy synced with that urgency. Fast-track green channels let designated companies import lab equipment within days. Custom exemptions took aim at absurdities like paying duty on reagents that expired in transit. Tax rulings clarified ESOP taxation timing so you didn't get punished for staying. And for deep tech, programmatic grants picked specific gaps. Fabless chip design tool credits, biotech wet lab subsidies, testing infrastructure you could book by the hour. Competition between states stayed disciplined. Instead of blind subsidies, many tied benefits to headcount, training hours, export performance, and IP filings. Miss targets, lose a tranche, hit targets, expand automatically. That contract-like structure told returnees something vital. Expectations run both ways and someone's tracking the scoreboard. It wasn't perfect, but it was legible. A quiet layer formed under all this, talent brokers who weren't headhunters in the old sense. They were returnee whisperers. They introduced families to neighborhoods, paired kids to schools, set up breakfast with founders and dinner with policy folks who could actually answer tricky questions. They ran small dinners where a chip design lead met a power electronics founder and a state officer in plain clothes. Trust formed in rooms without logos, and answers arrived without PR. Big Tech's India hubs started earning veto power. If a feature broke in Jakarta, the war room wasn't only in California. Bengaluru's lead could ship a fix overnight because he owned the architecture. Those moments changed internal maps. You stop being an annex when your decisions calm markets, and once product ownership settles, people follow. The Playbook also respected career arcs. Not everyone wanted to jump home in one move. So companies institutionalized split roles, 2 quarters remote leading, 2 quarters in-country. Universities offered visiting professorships that doubled as R&D scouting tour. Sabbaticals morphed into builder-in-residence gigs at city innovation labs. People sampled the new normal without burning bridges. Meanwhile, a different class of returnee arrived, the operator founder. She'd shipped machine learning features at scale and wanted to build on UPI rails the West didn't have. He'd run FDA submissions and wanted to compress clinical ops timelines using India's trial capacity. They weren't coming to replicate. They were coming to exploit asymmetries. The state welcomed them with sandboxes, fintech, health tech, drones, where regulators watched closely and iterated faster than legacy jurisdictions dared. None of this erased risk. There were still permits, still neighbors who complained about generator noise, still tax notices that arrived with creative interpretations. But the balance tilted. The system started feeling less like a maze and more like an airport, crowded, imperfect, but designed to move you through if you prepared. Here's the quiet truth: talent follows friction gradients. India's Playbook didn't try to outspend the West on salaries, it outdesigned it on momentum. When every button you press moves something the same day, your brain rewires, momentum becomes your manager, decisions speed up, teams form, roadmaps compress. And once that happens at scale, people stop asking if they should move, they ask how soon. Stress tests, crises that could break the flywheel. Momentum hides fragility. The charts look clean until they don't. The first crack is employment that isn't unemployment, degrees without direction, certificates without command. In a city college, a 21-year-old with 3 online badges can write Python but can't debug a production crash. A factory hires, trains for 6 weeks, and loses him in 4 months to a call center. The macro reads youthful advantage. The floor manager reads churn. If the skilling ladder misses the middle rungs, technicians, supervisors, clinical coordinators, the flywheel stalls at the handoff. Meanwhile, underemployment eats morale. A biomedical graduate becomes a sales rep because the lab nearby can't afford consumables. A diploma holder in electricals installs inverters not because he wants to, but because the grid firm's apprentice program filled in an hour. Microstory: a welding trainee in a defense corridor aces simulation tests, then freezes on live metal because no one scheduled enough supervised hours. He walks out embarrassed. He doesn't return. Multiply. Certifications without craft turn optimism into ash. Next comes infrastructure bottlenecks that don't trend on social media. A substation that flickers under summer load, a port that handles containers but chokes on customs inspection bays, an arterial road that turns a 10-kilometer commute into 90 minutes. A chip packaging plant runs a dry room, humidity spikes after a local outage, scrap rises, a quarter's target slip. The fix isn't a speech. It's a spare transformer, a service contract, a reliability culture. Ports cut dwell time, but 1 scanner down adds a day. Logistics managers buffer, and buffers are tax. Urban congestion punishes time itself. A product head spends 3 hours in traffic daily and pretends it's normal. An ops lead moves farther out for a school seat, then misses stand-ups. A startup relocates to a fringe hub and loses half its senior talent who won't add 45 minutes each way. Cities must move. If they don't, velocity moves elsewhere. Regulatory whiplash lurks. A sudden circular reinterprets marketplace rules mid-quarter. A compliance team scrambles, engineers patch, investors adjust forecasts with clenched teeth. In fintech, a revised KYC rule lands on a Friday. By Monday, onboarding drops 30%. The regulator clarifies a week later, but users have drifted. Trust isn't just law, it's continuity. If policy can switch lanes without guardrails, boards slow down to survive. There's a deeper risk: centralization of judgment. If a handful of desks can freeze a sector with an ambiguous line, talent builds cynicism. People stop choosing hard problems because hard problems attract oversight with inconsistent cadence. The counter is process, publish drafts, hold hearings, time-box decisions, honor sandboxes with clear graduation. Builders can work with tough rules. They can't work with unknowable ones. Social cohesion is the pressure nobody budgets for. Polarization doesn't just trend, it extracts. A hiring manager skips a great candidate based on a surname, then calls it fit. A neighborhood committee fights a dormitory for migrant workers, slower buses, louder nights, more police visits. A rumor flares, curfews fall, night shifts slip, contracts penalize. Micro story, a drone startup's test range closes for a week after a local flare-up. A milestone misses, cash-in slips. The founder spends the next 2 months rebuilding community ties instead of firmware. If trust between communities cracks, productivity bleeds into policing emotion. Brain drain 2 isn't impossible if agency fades. Returnees who built mentorship trees can also reroute them. If promotions stall under politics, if gatekeepers punish dissent, if mobility narrows, the loop reverses. The same WhatsApp groups that accelerated return can accelerate exit. The antidote isn't messaging. It's merit that holds under pressure and a culture that punishes abuse of gatekeeping fast. Global shocks arrive like uninvited audits. Export slumps cascade through suppliers. A European downturn hits Indian auto ancillaries, overtime stops, attrition rises, commodity spikes turn P&L into coin toss. A chemical feedstock doubles, small manufacturers eat the cost or break contracts. Sanctions spillovers pinch components, a robotics team redesigns around missing servos, shipping slips. Resilience becomes a function. Second source contracts, inventory visibility, hedges that someone actually monitors, and operational cash buffers that aren't wishful. China risk cuts both ways. Diversification brings orders, but it also brings geopolitical weather. A border flare changes procurement moods overnight. Insurance premia climb, dual-use exporters need spotless trails. A single misstep invites controls that freeze lines for months. Compliance isn't a memo, it's a team with teeth and authority. Climate is the slow test that feels fast up close. Heat waves push grids past design, factories shift to nights, logistics slip, health incidents rise, floods erase a quarter's inventory in a basement warehouse that skipped an elevation map. Coastal units see insurance exclusions multiply. A city water plant ration forces fabs to truck in water, costs jump, PR risks spike. Adaptation budgets must graduate from slide decks to pumps, berms, shade, changed schedules, and clear municipal compacts. Politics remains the metronome. If a policy compact breaks, contract sanctity weakens, tax certainty dissolves, capital prices in exit optionality. You feel it as hesitation, then as drift. The cure is boring institutional guardrails that outlast slogans, commercial benches staffed and funded, regulators protected from whipsaw, data laws enforced with proportionality, procurement rules honored even when inconvenient. Here's a human snapshot to land it. A 24-year-old in Ranchi joins a storage startup after a 3-month apprenticeship that smashed imposter syndrome. On a heatwave day, a battery pack fails in the field. The company runs a root cause analysis, posts the graph, pushes a fix, informs the DISCOM. No blame theater, no cover-up. The grid holds the next week. She goes home and tells her father, "We messed up and then we fixed it." That sentence is the Flywheel's immune system. None of these stress tests are new, they're compounding. The question isn't if shocks come, it's whether the culture, policy, firms, cities, teams chooses rigor over rhetoric when they do. If it holds, the board flips. If it doesn't, the leak returns. The next act decides whether momentum grows up into resilience. The geopolitical endgame, non-alignment 2. Power moved in boardrooms, but it settled on maps. Non-alignment never died, it updated its software. Call it multi-alignment, choose partners by project, not by pledge. The US brings capital, tech, and security frameworks. Russia lingers as legacy energy defense spares, a memory of supply when others hesitated. Gulf capital funds infrastructure at speed. East Asia supplies precision, discipline, and parts on time. The bet isn't fence-sitting. It's portfolio theory applied to the state. Get this, 1 week an Indian minister lands in Washington to sign semiconductor MOAs. The next, a delegation flies to Abu Dhabi to close sovereign LP commitments into infrastructure and climate funds. A month later, trade talks in Tokyo line up supply for machine tools and EV components. The same quarter, discounted crude ships from Russia, refined in India, exported onward. Critics call it contradiction. Operators call it hedged. Trade corridors stitch the logic into geography. The India, Middle East, Europe corridor promised ports, rail, and clean energy carried like cargo, hydrogen pipelines, and power lines with standard plugs. SAGAR reframed the Indian Ocean as a responsibility, not just a route. Ports in the neighborhood supported, white-hulled cutters visiting, training offered without lectures. On the other flank, the Indo-Pacific posture matured. Exercises with quad navies, logistics agreements that let ships refuel and repair, a quiet upgrade to maritime domain awareness. The message wasn't loud. It was constant. The routes will stay open and will be present where that promise gets tested. Standards became soft power that felt hard in practice. UPI-style payment rails exported to partners, with India's stack offered as digital public goods. Identity pipes that could onboard citizens in minutes, consent artifacts that traveled with data, open protocols that avoided vendor lock-in. A partner nation launched a domestic UPI equivalent with Indian technical help, then linked switches for cross-border remittances priced in cents, not dollars. Small sums moved families and families moved politics. Fintech standards turned into leverage at negotiation tables. Adopt rails, get integration help. Respect data protocols, get market access. Quiet, yes, but binding. Demographics gave those standards a workforce. A youth bulge, often framed as burden, acted like reserve power. Services absorbed millions call centers to product teams, while manufacturing scaled lines that trained middle-skill workers at speed. When Gulf infrastructure firms needed thousands of technicians, India trained and shipped them with certifications that mapped to foreign standards. When East Asian manufacturers wanted to diversify lines, India offered headcount and a learning culture built on checklists, not bravado. Demography mattered because it met discipline. With markets and minds in hand, bargaining changed. Market access became a chip you trade, not a prize you give. You want to sell high-end equipment, pair it with tech transfer and local value-add schedules. You want defense deals, co-develop, co-produce, and agree export rights up front. A jet engine conversation once framed as when turned into how much IP, which modules, what timeline. A missile program sought seekers and composites expertise with eyes open to induce assurances and audit trails. Western firms, used to diktats, met a buyer with options. Option sets become leverage. Microstory, a senior U.S. executive pitched cloud expansion. India's team nodded, pointed to localization requirements that weren't theater, financial data residency, audit access, disaster recovery within bounded latency. The pitch pivoted. Joint cloud centers with transparent failover logs and regulators invited into live drills. The deal closed, but the terms looked Indian. That's standards power in a suit and tie. Russia's legacy ties stayed pragmatic. Spares for long-lived platforms kept flowing. Energy discounts buffered inflation. But dependency shrank by design, diversified barrels, diversified vendors, diversified votes at the UN. The stance wasn't romance, it was risk management amid a war-rough sea. Gulf ties deepened with equity instead of aid, ports, data centers, renewables, and PE money parked for decade-long arcs. East Asia brought precision to the shop floor. Korean steels, Japanese machine tools, Taiwanese PCB lines, paired with training academies that didn't leave when the ribbon cut. Meanwhile, India chaired rooms it once watched. G20 sessions ended with communiques that read like compromise and operated like consensus. A digital public infrastructure line nestled between climate and finance paragraphs. Small countries asked for help wiring their states. Code flew faster than loans. That planted a flag without a flag. There were tests, sanctions regimes tightened around components with dual-use potential. Export control lists updated mid-quarter. India's drone makers learned to certify provenance down to screws. Compliance became a comparative advantage. Clean supply chains fetched premium trust. Maritime tensions flickered, patrols answered. A cyber incident probed a telecom vendor. Response teams isolated, disclosed, patched. Non-alignment, too, didn't mean neutrality on law. It meant agency in enforcement. Here's the irony: by refusing to be a client state, India became a sought partner state. The Diaspora loop from earlier acts acted as backchannel. Policy notes drafted on Signal, concerns surfaced before they calcified, language tuned so partners could say yes at home. Proximity to growth markets gave urgency, proximity to standards gave structure. The endgame isn't an empire, it's a node. Trade runs through, data runs through, trust runs through, talent runs through. When a country becomes the place where the world tests interoperability, in payments, in logistics, in clinical data, in supply chains, it earns vetoes without shouting. The board is set not for a showdown, but for a long game where hedged bets and working rails outpace ideology. The boardroom reversal when the West blinked. It started with calendar math. A global product was missing deadlines, usage spiked in markets the HQ didn't understand, and the team that kept saving launches sat in Bengaluru. So a board met, stared at a latency chart, and did something nobody in that room expected. They moved product ownership to India, not a feature. The product, roadmap, budget, P&L, and the right to say no. Inside a Californian glass box, an SVP slid a memo across the table. The India lead would decide release gates. Compliance side, legal warned, finance hedged. Then Jakarta crashed again, and the patch that steadied the market shipped overnight from Hyderabad. The debate ended. Authority follows reliability. Once that domino fell, others followed. A European bank with chronic SME loan defaults moved underwriting tooling to Mumbai because the models trained on GST-linked cash flows lived there. A medtech firm assigned post-market surveillance to Hyderabad because the audit evidence could be pulled from DigiLocker trails. A cloud vendor asked the India team to define disaster recovery drills, and regulators joined live. Policies didn't force this. Performance did. M&A flows inverted quietly. An Indian SaaS company bought a Baltimore startup for relationships it couldn't hire, flipped the codebase to India's cost velocity curve, and doubled enterprise renewals. A mid-cap Indian pharma acquired a distressed plant outside Lyon and ran validation with a playbook honed in Hyderabad, hitting timelines European auditors respected. The symbol changed, not India as target, but India as buyer, with operators who could integrate without breaking culture or customers. Universities fed the shift. A top IIT's lab partnered with a German institute on power electronics, spun out a startup, and placed grads who turned down Bay Area offers to join a team writing standards the Bay would later adopt. A Hyderabad research park started a ladder, internship to thesis to seed round, that beat the predictable path to a Silicon Valley residency for specific domains. For speech, for chips verification, for fintech plumbing, the fastest learning curve sat closer to the rails. Western policymakers tried to stem the outflow with copycat moves. Fast-track visas aimed at Indian STEM grads, startup visas with PR pathways, university industry bridges promising lab to market in a year, useful but late. Return had prestige now, and more importantly, leverage. The offer had to be ownership, not a nicer holding pattern. Builders don't queue for prestige, they move for mandate. In one boardroom, the reversal became a story people whisper. Remember the team that resigned in our cold open? They left a West Coast unicorn after 3 reorgs and a promotion that felt like a title swap. In Bengaluru, they built a product that ate a niche their old employer ignored. 2 years later, their growth started hurting the parent company's core. The CFO proposed a defensive investment. The founders declined. 6 months after that, the acquirer flew in, same company, different tone. The deal closed with the returnees in the buyer's chairs, keeping the culture and the cadence, folding in the legacy product only where it didn't slow the sprint. The West didn't implode, it blinked. Policy mirrored the blink. A G7 task force asked for technical assistance on digital public infrastructure. Payment regulators compared rails and adopted pieces that look suspiciously like UPIs in Iraq. A privacy working group invited India's data fiduciary architects to brief a room that once treated them as curiosities. Standards travel slower than press, but they stick longer. The tables where standards get drafted had new chairs. Meanwhile, Western execs updated their mental models. India wasn't a cost center or a hedge. It was the place where problems with messy users got solved at speed. A CFO who once capped headcount in remote regions lifted the cap where dashboards flashed green. HR recalibrated comp bands toward global parity to stop losing architects. Legal learned Indian commercial benches moved fast enough to enforce SLAs, and deals sized up. Not everything flipped at once. Some HQs clung to old maps. Some boards kept pretending time zones were the problem, not mandates, but stories accumulate. A logistics reroute during a port strike came from Chennai. A voice feature that doubled retention in Indonesia shipped from Pune. A drone swarming demo that unlocked a defense contract ran in a Tamil Nadu corridor with logs that met NATO-grade audit expectations. Every time ownership proved safer in India, budgets followed. Here's the punchline: the reversal wasn't rhetorical, it was operational. Western companies ceded control not because they were generous, but because risk lived where they were slow. India's teams absorbed control because they'd built rails, habits, and a legal spine suited to decision velocity. Boards blinked, then reworded their playbooks, put ownership where outcomes occur. The map that began with a brain drain ended with mandate gravity. When agency concentrates, power follows. The resolution isn't a victory lap. It's a new baseline. Work goes where trustable speed lives, where decisions become outcomes on schedule. Resolution and meaning. The future follows agency, and agency follows places that turn decisions into outcomes fast. If you want the next chapter, the AI compute race built on these rails and the supply chains bending around them, watch the deep dive lined up here. Subscribe for more true stories built from people, stakes, and turning points. The legal regulatory backbone few saw coming. Factories hummed, but something quieter made CFOs breathe easier. The paperwork finally learned to close loops. The insolvency and bankruptcy code arrived like a stern adult at a messy dinner table. Before it, defaults dragged on for years. After it, lenders could drag a failing firm into a time-bound process with teeth. A resolution professional took charge, committees voted, and assets moved to people who'd actually use them. It wasn't flashy, it was final. And finality is oxygen for capital. Get this: one steel mill in distress changed hands in months instead of limboing for a decade. Workers kept jobs, creditors recovered more than pocket change, and competitors recalibrated risk models. In boardrooms from Mumbai to Singapore, debt committees updated slides, recovery rates up, timelines down. Private credit, which hates fog, started to price India differently because enforceability kills ambiguity. A returnee founder who once dreaded taking a loan suddenly found terms that didn't assume eternal purgatory. Meanwhile, GST did something that felt impossible, turned a patchwork into a map. One tax, one network, invoices flowing through a single lattice. A trucker who once waited days at state borders cruised through with e-way bills pinging checkpoints automatically. Logistics managers stopped planning for naps at the toll desk. Time saved turned into cash saved. A supply chain director in Pune cut safety stock by a third because the data proved transit times had real variance bands, not stories. When inventories shrink, cash frees, and freed cash hires people. Digitization of logistics layered in quietly. Fastag tolls, RFID yard management, railway freight APIs. Suddenly a planner could see where a container actually was, not where someone said it was. A textile exporter in Tirupur shaved 2 days from a Colombo transshipment because his forwarder now had to show timestamps, not promises. Multiply that by quarters and you get a margin you can feel. Arbitration matured in parallel. Commercial benches in high courts carved out time for business disputes, and institutional arbitration centers sold a new pitch: pay for speed, get enforceability. Contracts started naming seats and timelines with specificity, deadlines with teeth, venues with memory. A SaaS company that used to dread chasing a delinquent client leaned on a clause that sent the fight to a domestic center with teeth. The dispute resolved in months, not folklore. Western GCs took notice. If you can draft predictable exits for disagreements, you can enter bigger agreements. Data law stepped into the room with guardrails instead of stop signs. Privacy rules codified consent, storage limits, and fiduciary duties, but they also carved paths for cross-border flows with accountability. Regulators pulled startups into sandboxes to test edge cases, wrote FAQs in plain language, and tuned enforcement to intent and remediation. A health tech founder reran her consent UX twice in a month because a regulator asked sharper questions and offered actual feedback. The outcome wasn't fear, it was clarity, and clarity keeps builders from freezing. What nobody clocked at first was how these pieces reinforced each other. IBC gave lenders courage to fund capex because exits were real. GST gave CFOs confidence in forecasts because taxes match flows. Arbitration gave counterparties courage to commit because timelines were enforceable. Data law gave product teams boundaries that still allowed iteration. The mesh made India legible to people who signed checks for a living: CFOs, credit committees, auditors. Here's a micro story. A mid-market PE fund acquired a distressed specialty chemicals plant through an IBC process. They walked in on Monday with the keys, not a stay order. Vendors paid under a court-blessed plan, restarted deliveries that week. Power dues got a schedule. Within a quarter, the plant hit 85% capacity. The fund's operating partner, a returnee who'd sworn off Indian turnarounds, told his wife, "We can do 5 more of these." The difference wasn't luck. It was a docket that moved. State capacity grew in unexpected corners. MCA portals stabilized, DINs and DSCs became routine, and grievance redress dashboards showed who wasn't answering. A founder filed an incorporation on Tuesday and got a bank ready certificate by Friday. He didn't throw a party, he signed a lease. Meanwhile, income tax faceless assessments cut the theater out of scrutiny. Less chai, more checklists, not zero friction, but fewer fatal surprises. Global boards recalibrated. India stopped being an optional slide at the end of a deck and became the second tab in strategy. A European bank moved product ownership for SME lending tools to Mumbai because the legal plumbing, KYC, consent, GST data pipes existed and was readable. A US medtech company ran post-market surveillance from Hyderabad because reporting standards could be met programmatically. The decision wasn't sentimental, it was operational. There were still misses. Policy zigzags scared people, e-commerce rules debated mid-quarter, sudden clarifications that felt like rewrites. But a new reflex formed: consult, sandbox, iterate. Trade bodies learned to show up with code and case studies, not slogans. Regulators took calls. The cycle time of understanding shortened. That alone saved careers. And then the courts did something cultural. Commercial benches started issuing reasoned orders fast enough to matter in the quarter they were needed. Lawyers adjusted their advice from wait it out to compile your evidence. That shift trickled down to contracts. Parties got serious about documentation because it now counted within months, not millennia. In the end, the backbone looked nothing like a headline. It looked like ledgers that reconciled, orders that stuck, and laws that explained themselves. Western boards, allergic to mystery, found a jurisdiction that spoke a language they trusted: time-bound, API-fed, audit-friendly. India became core not because of a slogan, but because the legal and regulatory stack finally behaved like infrastructure. And when infrastructure holds, bigger bets walk in on their own. The West's slow leak: why talent is walking. While India built rails and rules, something else was cracking across the ocean. The leak didn't start with headlines. It started with calendars. Engineers in Seattle refreshed the H-1B portal like it was a stock ticker. a biomedical researcher in Toronto counted the months in a permanent residency backlog that kept sliding right. A product manager in London couldn't sign a longer lease because her visa renewal window didn't match the landlord's patience. Lives on hold turn drive into drift, and drift kills ambition faster than failure. Here's a micro story. Neil wrote code for a top 5 tech firm. His green card wait time stretched past a decade. His daughter asked if she could apply to a state science camp without risking travel while we're waiting. He didn't have a clean answer. At work, he got the performance bonus and the same title for the 3rd year. His boss said, "We'll revisit promotion next cycle." He stared at the wall. The loop felt endless. When a Bengaluru team offered him product ownership with decisions that stuck, he didn't run toward India as much as he stepped away from stasis. Visa precarity intersected with life's basics. Housing costs in Bay Area zip codes turned starter homes into math problems only founders could solve. Toronto's rentals spiked, then vanished. London's commute crept to 90 minutes and nurseries quoted waitlists longer than IVF cycles. Meanwhile, mid-career ladders narrowed. Flattened org charts sounded modern, but they hid a truth: fewer rungs for more climbers. If you're 38 and your next shot requires a VP retiring, you start checking other maps. Research felt the drag too. Labs once flush with rapid grants grew hedged by compliance. An assistant professor in Boston spent more time writing IRB amendments than running assays. A clinical AI team in Cambridge watched its test deployment stall because 5 committees each needed one more revision. Risk management mattered, but risk aversion calcified. When your fastest experiment is a literature review, your best people look for velocity elsewhere. Corporate cultures shifted in subtle ways. In the pandemic's aftermath, remote work removed office migraines but also blurred agency. Decisions stretched across time zones with no one at the center. A machine learning lead spent 3 quarters shepherding a feature across 3 legal jurisdictions and 4 product councils. The release slid, the impact softened, the narrative died. Contrast that with India's UPI-era cadence: ship, measure, ship again, and you see why dopamine and then talent moved hemispheres. Meanwhile, the cost of living squeeze bled into dignity. Young parents in New York paid for childcare that matched a mortgage. Mid-career engineers in Vancouver did mental gymnastics at the grocery aisle. Healthcare that came with jobs still left gaps, and gaps burned savings. Across text threads, a new line replaced old bravado: "It's good, but is it good enough to wait 10 more years?" That sentence moved families faster than any recruiter. Then there was status. 10 years ago, going back felt like a concession. Today, return has prestige, not performative patriotism, operational respect. The alumni group that once traded visa hacks now trades vendor references and policy notes. Returnees post product wins that matter: state-scale deployments, factory lines launched, drones cleared for export. Winning beats longing. Agency beats nostalgia. Prospective movers absorb a simple signal. Proximity to growth markets multiplies your odds of writing the spec, not implementing someone else's. Family calculus leaned in. Grandparents aged. Caregiving from 6,000 miles away turned into guilt on a screen. Parents learned they could get credible elder care in Bengaluru or Pune and see results on an app. Schools at home looked less like compromises and more like options. A dual-income couple in San Jose ran the numbers and realized the same savings curve in India bought time with kids, with parents, with a career you actually steered. None of this was universal. Plenty stayed and many willed, but the gradients sharpened. Western policy got noisier, not clearer. Populist cycles targeted immigration with rhetoric that chilled rooms where visas got stamped. Research budgets faced partisan whiplash. Housing reforms crawled. Meanwhile, global tech cycles cooled and large companies layered process over process to protect incumbents. Talented people stared at their calendars and asked the question that decides careers: where will my compounding be fastest? One more micro story. A robotics PhD in Munich built warehouse systems no customer would risk in production. Safety, liability, committees, each valid, together paralyzing. He flew to Chennai for a cousin's wedding, visited an industrial park, and watched a pilot run with risk controls and a go-no-go date in 2 weeks. He moved 6 months later. It wasn't safety versus speed. It was accountable speed versus indefinite pause. Western managers noticed the exits and tried to counter with retention bonuses, title tweaks, and hybrid flexibility. Useful but misaligned. The core leak wasn't perks. It was agency, immigration certainty, and proximity to build cycles. Without fixes on those fronts, bonuses bought time, not loyalty. The irony: the Diaspora's success made leaving easier. Returnees proved the path, demystified paperwork, named schools, recommended neighborhoods, shared ESOP clauses that wouldn't bite. They ran Zooms where spouses asked the real questions. They told the truth about the hassles and the payoffs. And truth, credible, detailed, unsentimental, closed the loop. Push met pull. Visas that stalled met visas that welcomed. Calendars that froze met calendars that moved. Org charts that froze met mandates that moved. Compliance creep met sandboxes that iterated in public. Life on hold met life with motion. The slow leak turned into a steady flow not because the West failed, but because it failed to move at the pace its best people needed. The new Diaspora loop, two-way power. The split life that once felt unstable turned into strategy. Dual-rooted careers got schedules. 6 months in Bengaluru running sprints, 6 months in Boston closing enterprise deals. A chip architect kept a desk in Santa Clara for partner meetings and a flat in Indernagar for the tape-out crunch. Remote leadership stopped being a concession, it became leverage. Teams learned to flip clocks, rotate on-call, and keep velocity steady across oceans. The question wasn't where you live. It was where decisions stick. Capital followed the people, then looped back. Diaspora LPs who'd made their money in Palo Alto and London wrote India-first checks with a different patience profile. They knew the cadence, longer build cycles for manufacturing, faster loops for Rails-based software, milestone-based tranches that didn't drown founders in updates. A New Jersey cardiologist pooled with 10 friends to anchor a seed fund in Hyderabad. The fund backed 10 startups, 2 hit product-market fit on UPI and ONDC, 1 exited via Manila SPAC, and the LPs recycled returns into a climate hardware fund focused on storage components. Money didn't just arrive, it learned and returned. Knowledge moved even faster. The Diaspora became an arbitrage engine, shifting lessons across borders before white papers landed. A health tech founder in Coimbatore borrowed workflow discipline from Mayo Clinic rotations and mapped it onto district hospitals with eKYC and affordable cloud. An agri-tech team in Punjab lifted precision irrigation playbooks from Israel and adapted them to smallholder realities with cooperative financing linked to UPI. A climate hardware startup in Bengaluru pulled battery pack standards from Germany, then rewrote thermal runaway protocols for Indian heat. The edge wasn't invention, it was translation with speed. Universities built bridges that didn't wait for consulates. Joint Labs paired a Boston robotics group with an IIT mechanical cluster, shipping hardware to a Chennai warehouse and running tests over livestream with local safety officers. Sabbatical programs swapped professors for a semester. PhD candidates did co-advised theses with fieldwork in India and defense in the US. A materials science student split her year, cleanroom time in Singapore, field deployment on coastal corrosion sensors in Kochi. Her inbox had 3 job offers before her Viva, 1 in California, 2 in Bengaluru. She chose the lab that promised to ship her sensor network across ports within 6 months. The choice explained the loop. Policy started listening both ways. Diaspora operators joined advisory councils without the ceremony that used to stall good ideas. They carried scars from other regimes and helped draft rules with fewer traps. ESOP taxation windows aligned to liquidity, drone BVLOS tests with risk bans, data sharing consent receipts that were machine-readable and human-legible. On the other side, returnees whispered to Western policymakers about what cooperation looked like in practice. Reciprocal recognition of clinical data, export control clarity for dual-use components, visa categories that mapped to remote leadership instead of relocation. The bridge worked because both sides brought specifics, not slogans. Microstories made it real. A former Detroit auto engineer spent 3 months a year in Pune helping a Tier 1 supplier reach ISO 26262 compliance. He didn't move, he looped. A New York fintech CISO took a board seat at a Bengaluru neobank and ran quarterly red team drills from a Brooklyn loft while visiting twice a year to close the audit loop in person. A London-based oncologist built a tumor board that met online every Wednesday, half the cases from Manchester, half from Mumbai. The loop wasn't theory, it was a calendar invite with outcomes attached. M&A flows learned the new routes. An Indian SaaS firm acquired a struggling San Diego competitor for its Fortune 500 relationships, kept the US team intact, and shifted product ownership to Pune. A mid-size Indian pharma firm bought a small Swiss biotech for a pipeline and used India's trial network to accelerate. Integration used to be the graveyard. Now Diaspora operators ran playbooks, compliance checklists, cultural translators, ESOP rollover tutorials, customer success calls that introduced new SLAs with less fluff and more screenshots. Deals stuck because people who spoke both languages stayed in the room and owned the post-close checklist. Remote tooling matured around the loop. Data rooms lived in compliance with both regimes. Payroll systems handled split residencies without turning founders into tax clerks. Insurance products covered trips that were half business, half caregiving. Even real estate adapted short-term leases near hubs with school tie-ins, and concierge immigration helped that actually knew what the forms meant. The hassles didn't vanish. They got productized. The loop produced a new kind of founder, one who treated geography like an interface, not an identity. She pitched in San Francisco on Monday, onboarded regulators into a sandbox in Mumbai on Wednesday, and closed a distribution partner in Jakarta on Friday. Her deck didn't wave flags, it mapped execution. Investors trusted her because she could point to a war room in Bengaluru that shipped on rails Western markets didn't have yet, and a sales desk in Austin that knew how to talk to risk-averse buyers. That blend sold. There were frictions, time zones punished families, kids juggled syllabi, parents needed more care than an app could manage, some loops snapped under strain, but the system learned. Companies funded caregiver stipends, schools coordinated credits, teams enforced dark hours to protect sleep. The purpose wasn't to romanticize the hustle, it was to routinize it enough that talent didn't burn out. And then the loop did something geopolitical. It normalized non-alignment at the personal level. People operated in multiple systems without demanding one absorb the other. They used American capital, Indian rails, European standards, and Asian supply chains in one plan. The passport stopped being the map. The network did. When the loop stabilized, leverage shifted. You could say no to bad deals. You could shop mandates across borders. You could move work, not just bodies. And that's when the game changed from return to reach. Strategic sectors, AI, energy, and biotech. Momentum needed frontiers, not just features. AI, energy, and biotech became the fields where returnees stopped asking for permission and started writing the spec. The advantage wasn't mystique. It was ingredients, compute priced creatively, data that reflected real-world mess, regulators who would sit in a room and ask questions in plain language, and markets that responded in weeks, not years. AI teams formed around a simple truth. India's internet isn't English first. A group in Bengaluru trained vernacular language models on code-mixed corpora nobody else had, WhatsApp voice notes transcribed with consent, regional news archives, call center logs anonymized and licensed. They tuned for Hinglish, Tamil English, Gujarati slang, and built ASR that handled truck horns, temple bells, and street noise. A returnee who'd led multimodal research at a Bay Area lab moved home to push edge inference on cheap phones, fully offline summarization for government forms, voice bots that scheduled clinic appointments in Bundelli. Compute wasn't infinite, so they stacked efficiency. Quantization, distillation, sparse attention. Data centers in Hyderabad brokered GPU hours with off-peak pricing. A public research cloud piloted shared clusters for labs and startups, allocation visible on a dashboard. The business model followed the rails, per transaction billing over UPI, audit trails in DigiLocker, consent receipts standardized. The pitch to global buyers wasn't bigger models. It was models that actually work where your next 100 million users live. Edge AI bled into logistics and defense. A drone swarm firm trained vision systems on dusty quarry footage and nighttime thermal feeds, then shipped to mining firms on weekdays and border forces on weekends under dual-use protocols. A warehouse robotics company learned to run robust perception in dim brown warehouses, then sold the same stack to Southeast Asia where lighting looked similar. The export wasn't software alone. It was confidence earned in messy conditions. Energy ran on a different clock, fewer sprints, bigger stakes. Solar auctions forced discipline on tariffs. Returns depended on shaving losses at every stage. State grids upgraded, but intermittency still bit. Storage pilots turned into programs. A returnee battery chemist from Shenzhen ran a pilot line that stitched Indian cell components with licensed IP targeting hot climate stability over headline energy density. Their packs passed brutal desert cycle tests, then won orders for telecom tower backup and e-bus fleets. The leap wasn't a gigafactory overnight. It was supply chains that clicked locally, anode plants near ports, foil suppliers certified, EMS firms retooled to assemble BMS boards like they once assembled phones. Contracts tied payouts to dispatchability and degradation curves, not hype. A state DISCOM signed a 3-year peak shaving agreement, penalty-backed data log. You could point at a graph and see the cash. Green hydrogen moved from panels to pipelines, slow, deliberate, specific. Electrolyzer pilots paired steel plants with nearby renewables, the power flow tracked by smart meters rather than brochures. A metallurgist from Duisburg joined an Indian steel major to trial hydrogen blends in furnaces. They published failure modes and mitigation plans instead of slogans. Meanwhile, a logistics startup ran green ammonia trials for coastal bunkering, mapping safety protocols from Japan to Indian ports with local drills. Minerals diplomacy sat in the background, lithium sources negotiated with South American partners, critical mineral refining MOUs with Australia, recycling mandates built early to avoid tomorrow's scramble. The returnees who'd done commodity risk for banks wrote hedging playbooks that manufacturers actually used. Then biotech quietly potent. Vaccine expertise from prior decades gave India credibility, but the new layer came from flow and fidelity. A genomics lab in Hyderabad ran population-scale sequences under a data fiduciary framework. Consent was visible, revocation honored, secondary use approved in cohorts. A Stanford-trained bioinformatician came home to build variant detection workflows that alerted state health units within days. A low-cost trials network under Samir's umbrella from earlier acts scaled to oncology and rare disease using EICFs and tele-follow-ups. Time to first patient shortened again. a homegrown mRNA program paired with a European partner for LNP tech, manufacturing scaled and modular cleanrooms that could pivot indications. The regulator didn't wave things through. It sat in weekly reviews, tracked adverse events in software, and cleared expansions when dashboards held steady. Biotech blurred into digital. Pharmacies integrated with e-prescriptions, cold chain sensors piped data to insurers underwriting outcomes-linked payments. A returnee physician built an oncology decision support tool trained on Indian case histories, not borrowed priors, and embedded it into district tumor boards. The value wasn't replacing doctors, it was compressing the distance between good intent and best practice. These sectors needed talent with tolerance for ambiguity and affection for checklists. AI leads wrote red team docs for bias in dialects, storage founders published warranty curves, biotech teams ran QA like a religion. The culture looked like this: move fast, log everything, invite oversight that understands the work. The payoff wasn't just domestic wins. Standards emerged, vernacular ASR benchmarks, storage safety protocols, trial data schemas that other countries started to adopt. Standards are leverage. If your format becomes the default in 5 markets, you export terms, not just product. One micro story to land it. A founder building edge AI for rural clinics flew to Nairobi with a demo that handled Swahili-English code mix out of the box because they'd trained on Indian code mix discipline. A Kenyan hospital signed a pilot in a week. The founder called her team from a parking lot and said, "This is what happens when you build for noise." Back home, the energy team posted dispatch graphs after a heat wave, storage held, penalties avoided, cash in. The biotech lab shipped 1,000 sequence in a month, flagged a cluster, and pushed a dashboard to a district officer's phone before dinner. AI, energy, biotech, 3 arenas where returnees don't just come back, they come back with reach. The West still matters, partners still matter. But the center of action shifts to where models meet messy users, electrons meet grids, and molecules meet patients. That's where agency lives, and that's where India's compounding accelerates.